After studying this module, you shall be able to get a glimpse into the life of Sigmund Freud, around which the realm of psychoanalysis is built. Understand Freud's concept of instincts and learn about the life and death instincts. Study the 3 levels of consciousness. Understand Freud's structure of personality and the interaction between the id, ego, and superego. One of the most comprehensive approaches to personality and its development was formulated by Sigmund Freud. His insistence that behavior is determined by the interplay of events and conflicts within the inner life, that is, the intra-psychic events of the individual, is central to his approach and that of other dynamic theories. For Freud, all behavior is motivated. No chance is accidental happening cause behavior. All acts are determined by motives. Every human action has a cause and a purpose that can be discovered through psychoanalysis of thought associations, dreams, errors, and other behavioral clues to inner passions. Freud developed theories of personality based upon clinical observations and in-depth case studies of individual patients in therapy. His ideas were complex and touched many different issues. With respect to personality, however, the following topics are most central. Instincts and psychic energy. Instincts represent a dynamic or motivational principle postulated by Freud to explain the driving forces behind people's actions. The motivation to seek pleasure and to reduce tension is derived from the psychic energy that springs from their basic instincts. Levels of consciousness. Levels of consciousness describe Freud's earliest attempts to map out the nature of human mind in terms of the unconscious, preconscious, and conscious. Structure of personality. Freud's structural model divides personality into 3 major systems: id, ego, and superego that interact to govern human behavior. Anxiety and ego defense mechanisms. Anxiety and ego defense mechanisms are an important part of Freud's personality theory, as they are fundamental to the development of neurotic and psychotic behavior. Psychosexual stages of development. Psychosexual stages are an innate sequence of developmental stages that strongly shape the nature of our personality. Each stage is characterized by a particular erotogenic zone that serves as the primary source of pleasure. Biographical sketch. Sigmund Freud was born to Jacob and Amelia Freud at the end of the Romantic Age in 1856 in the town of Moravia of Austro-Hungarian Empire. When Freud was born, his father was 40 years old and his mother was only 20. The father was strict and authoritarian. As an adult, Freud recalled his childhood hostility, hatred, and rage towards his father. He wrote that he felt superior to his father as early as the age of 2. He spent majority of his life in Vienna, where being a Jew faced much hostility, and this climate has had a profound effect on his thought. After matriculating from the University of Vienna, he dabbled in medicine, philosophy, physiology, marine biology, psychiatry, and neuropathology. Interested in neurology, he studied further under the famous neurologist Jean Charcot in France. His educational background explains Freud's scientific tendencies and empiricism. He set up his practice in 1886 in Vienna. The same year, he married Martha Barnes and the couple had 6 children. Although he began with neurology, he gradually began developing his own methods of treatment like free association and dream interpretation. As a practicing psychologist, he became interested in hysteria and neurosis. Around 1990, he began developing the psychoanalytic theory. In the following years, Freud modified his theories and broadened it. His correspondence and involvement with other thinkers of his time like Franz Brentano, Ernst Bruch, Joseph Breuer, and Wilhelm Fleiss greatly impacted his theories and his convictions. He was also influenced by Nietzsche, Darwin, Lamarck, Haeckel, and Spencer, among many others. The term psychoanalysis appears 10 years after he began his practice. The Wednesday Psychological Society meetings that began in 1902 marked the beginnings of the psychoanalytic movement. In 1908, it was renamed the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. Due to the persecution of the Nazis, Freud had to leave Vienna for London. He was a chronic smoker and succumbed to buccal cancer in 1939. Although he did not originally intend it, he developed a full-fledged psychological system of thought and has come to be known as the father of psychoanalysis. Instincts and psychic energy. According to Freud, personality is a complex energy system and the ultimate cause of all activity is the drive or instinct. The source of the instincts is the chemophysical state of the organism and they represent the bridge between the physical and mental realms. The source might be an excitation within the body caused due to some deficiency or any other disturbance of the inner balance. The aim of any instinct is to remove the excitation and restore the inner equilibrium by discharge of energy. 2 primary instincts, eros, that is the life instinct, and thanatos, that is the death instinct. The form of energy by which life instincts perform their work is called libido. The sexual or the life instinct. Eros is a set of drives that deal with survival, reproduction, and pleasure. Despite the label eros, not all life instincts deal with erotic urges per se. Hunger and pain avoidance are also life instincts. According to Freud, sexual drives are many in number, and each is associated with a different area of the body, which is called an erogenous zone. The 3 erogenous zones identified by Freud are the mouth, the anus, and the genitals. These zones are potential sources of tension. Manipulating these areas relieves the tension and produces pleasure. Thus, sucking produces oral pleasure, emptying of bowels produces anal pleasure, and fondling of genitals produces genital pleasure. The death instinct. Freud remarked, "The goal of life is death." He believed that people unconsciously desire death and return to the inanimate state from which they came. Since the expression of death instinct is usually held in check by the life instincts, the effects of the death instincts aren't visible. Another aspect of the destructive instinct is that of aggression. Freud believed that aggression is not a basic drive, but that it stems from the thwarting of the death instincts. That is, if the eros thwarts the expression of thanatos, tension remains and energy is left unspent. This energy can be dissipated in the form of aggression towards others. Thus, aggression is an expression of self-destructive urges turned towards others. Ego instinct. There is also the ego instinct or the self-preservation instinct. This instinct, like the sexual instinct, follows the pleasure principle and works to procure pleasure and avoid pain. But the task of avoiding pain may force them to postpone or sometimes even renounce pleasure. This ability to compromise with reality and to consider what could be done and what price has to be paid for pleasure is the reality principle. The sexual instinct is in accordance with the purpose of preservation of the species and is more flexible than the self-preservation instinct. Psychic energy. Just as overt actions are powered by physical energy, mental activity involves constant expenditures of psychic energy. Psychic energy is unobservable and has no known physical correlates, despite Freud's belief that underlying neurological functions would ultimately be discovered. The form of energy by which life instincts perform their work is called the libido. Libido is wholly intrapsychic and never flows out of the mind into the outside world. It performs its work by following a law of conservation of energy. That is, if a forbidden act or impulse is suppressed, its energy will seek an outlet somewhere else in the system, possibly in a disguised form. The libido can be attached to or invested in mental representations of external objects that will satisfy instinctual needs, a process known as cathexis. If you like your roommate, for example, Freud would say that your libido is cathected to him or her. The object cathected upon may be a person, an idea, or a thing and is referred to as the object choice. The more important the object is, the more is the amount of energy cathected. The libido that has been cathected is no longer mobile and cannot move to new objects. It is rooted to whatever part of the psyche has attracted and held it. They explain the concept as follows. If you imagine your store of libido as a given amount of money, cathexis is the process of investing it. Once a portion has been invested or cathected, it remains there, leaving you with much less to invest elsewhere. The levels of consciousness. Freud compared the human mind to an iceberg. The small part that shows above the surface of the water is the conscious, which includes all those thoughts and feelings that are being experienced at a given moment. Beneath the conscious realm is the much larger preconscious, which contains information that is not currently on our mind, but we could bring into consciousness if called upon to do so. For example, you may not have been aware about what you got your mother for her last birthday, as you were reading the previous sentence, but now you are not able to recall it. Finally, beneath the preconscious and forming the bulk of the iceberg below the water is the unconscious, which is a storehouse of desires, impulses, and inaccessible memories that affect our thought and behavior. Since we are aware of their contents, we are likely to see the conscious and preconscious realms of the mind as the most prominent ones. However, Freud believed that the unconscious mind was more in size and importance. He wrote, "The conscious mind is an iceberg. It floats with only 1/7 of its bulk above water." The unconscious is a vast reservoir of impulses, fears, and hopes that lie beyond awareness. They are kept there by a censoring process called repression that protects the person from unacceptable wishes or threatening impulses. Although the unconscious could not be directly examined, its presence could be inferred from dreams, humor, forgetting, slips of the tongue, and through hypnosis and free association process of psychoanalysis. Freud was convinced that the unconscious played the dominant role in shaping personality and in determining human thought, feeling, and action. This topographic model was Freud's earliest attempt to map out the nature of human mind. The structure of personality. Freud discovered that his topographic model was too simple to describe the human personality, and so he went on to develop his structural model, which divided personality into three major systems: id, ego, and the superego, that interact to govern human behavior. These three systems correspond roughly to desire, reason, and conscious. The id. Id, derived from the Latin word meaning it, encompasses all the inherited, instinctive, and primitive aspects of personality. It functions entirely in the unconscious and is closely tied to instinctual biological processes, from which it draws its energy. The newborn child has only the id. The other two parts of the personality emerge later in life. Like a young child, the id operates on the pleasure principle, that is, the unregulated search for gratification to be experienced here and now without concern for the consequences, acting always to procure pleasure and avoid displeasure. It knows no right and wrong, no moral standards or values. It's carefree and takes no precautions to ensure survival. It has no thoughts of keeping itself alive or of protecting itself from danger. In fact, an immediate and unconditioned gratification of instinctual demand, forcefully pursued by the id, may lead to a dangerous clash with the external world and to the death of the organism. Id is the source of all psychic energy for the eros and thanatos. It has been called the engine of personality. Freud described id as a cauldron of seething excitement. The energy in the id is unbound, undirected, and uncontrolled, resource of an individual's vitality. The id leads an individual to the most irresponsible kind of actions resembling that of a neonate. The ego. This is the part of psyche that is in touch with the external reality. It exists at all levels of consciousness. The ego develops out of the id as the infant starts becoming aware of its own identity. It draws energy from the id and serves to pacify the untamed desires of the id. The ego has the task of ensuring the health, safety, and sanity of the personality. It has the function of satisfying the urges of the psyche in relation to the external reality. The ego can be aptly called the mediator. ego works towards self-preservation, keeping tabs on reality. It becomes aware of the external events, relates them to past events, and then either avoids the condition, adapts to it, or modifies the external world to make it safer. The ego is able to postpone the satisfaction or instant gratification as pushed by the id to times and circumstances that are favorable in the external world, that is, delay of gratification. The activities of ego are to regulate the level of tension produced by internal or external stimuli. A rise in tension is felt as discomfort, while a lowering of tension is felt as pleasure. So, the ego pursues pleasure and seeks to avoid or minimize pain as well. However, it works on the reality principle. It knows that urges need to be fulfilled, but in a controlled manner. Hence, the ego modulates the impulses of the id so that the individual can pursue a more realistic approach to life. The superego. Till about 5 years of age, the child is governed by the ego, mediating between the id and the external world. There is a sort of modified pleasure principle at work here, with the ego allowing the demands of the id whenever the external reality allows for it. The id still has a lot of say over the ego, and as a result of the weakness of the infantile ego, the superego emerges. The superego develops as a child comes to accept the prohibitions of parents and other adults against socially undesirable actions as his or her own values. In its initial stages, the superego is characterized by the fear of punishment and the conformity to parental demands. The development of superego completes in the phallic stage, where the issue of Oedipus complex is resolved and the child identifies with the same-sex parent. Identification with parents and idealizing them results in the child wanting to live up to their expectations and adopting their notions of morality. The superego hence strives for perfection and works on the morality principle. Over time, the superego develops further and the adult superego differs from the superego established by means of identification with parents. In well-adjusted adults, the superego plays the role of a self-observer and represents conscience and moral standards. It is the social and the moral frame of reference of the individual. The id and the superego can be thought of as arch enemies. The former hedonistic and impulsive, while the latter is the uncompromising disciplinarian. Differentiating between id, ego and superego. Id is biological in nature, ego is psychological in nature, and superego is social in nature. Id is present at birth, while ego is not present at birth. Superego develops around the age of 4 or 5. Ego develops out of the id during infancy, whereas superego when moral standards are internalized. Id is instinctual, irrational, impulsive, and the source of all psychic energy. Ego is rational, mediating, and realistic. It compromises between the id and the superego and acts as the executive of personality. Superego is moralistic, judgmental, and perfectionist. It consists of conscious and ego ideal. Id exists totally within the unconscious, whereas ego exists at all levels of consciousness. Superego, on the other hand, exists at all levels of consciousness. Id is driven by the pleasure principle. Its dictum is want, take. Ego is driven by the reality principle. Its dictum is wait. The conditions aren't appropriate. Take it later. Superego operates on the morality principle. Its dictum is don't you dare take it. That would be evil. Id, its primary function is to seek immediate gratification of biologically based urges. Ego, on the other hand, has primary function to mediate among the id, the realities of the world, and the superego. The function of superego is to inhibit the impulses of the id, persuade ego to substitute moralistic goals for realistic ones, and strive for perfection. It uses reflex actions and primary processes. Ego uses secondary processes, whereas superego uses guilt to punish and pride to reward. The three components of personality are often in opposition. The ego postpones the gratification and the id wants immediately, and the superego battles with both the id and the ego because behavior often falls short of the moral code it represents. In the well-integrated personality, the ego remains in firm but flexible control. The reality principle governs. However, as the id and superego pressures intensify, it becomes difficult for the ego to work out optimal compromises between the id and the superego. Freud felt that this constant struggle among id, ego, and superego plays a key role in personality and in many psychological disorders. In terms of his earlier topographic model, Freud proposed that all of the id and most of the ego and superego are submerged in the unconscious. Small parts of ego and superego are in either the conscious or preconscious. Freud's theory is at least partly autobiographical in that he based some of his major concepts on his childhood experiences. People are motivated by innate instincts that convert bodily needs into psychological tensions. We seek to gain pleasure by reducing these drives and to avoid displeasure. Life instincts serve the purpose of survival and are manifested in the form of psychic energy called libido. Death instincts are an unconscious drive towards decay, destruction, and aggression. The libido can be attached to or invested in mental representations of external objects that will satisfy instinctual needs, a process called cathexis. The more important the object is, the more is the amount of energy cathected. Freud compared the human mind to an iceberg. The small part that shows above the surface of the water is the conscious, which includes all those thoughts and feelings that are being experienced at a given moment. Beneath this conscious realm is the much larger preconscious, which contains information that is not currently on our mind, but we could bring into consciousness if called upon to do so. Finally, beneath the preconscious and forming the bulk of the iceberg below the water is the unconscious, which is a storehouse of desires, impulses, and inaccessible memories that affect our thought and behavior. Unconscious experiences cannot be called to mind without the aid of such psychoanalytic techniques as free association and dream interpretation. The three structures of the personality are the id, ego, and superego. The id, the biological component of personality, is the storehouse of instincts and libido. It operates in accordance with the pleasure principle. The ego, the rational component of personality, operates in accordance with the reality principle. The superego, the moral side of personality, consists of the conscious, that is, the behaviors for which the child is punished, and the ego ideal, that is, the behaviors for which the child is praised. The ego mediates among the demands of the id, the pressures of reality, and the diktats of the superego.